Despite it being past the NBA trade deadline, past the deadline for when players can be eligible to sign with a new team and participate in the playoffs, there's still some roster news to break down. Earlier today, we got some updates from ESPN's Adrian Wojnarowski, starting out with this, that free agent forward Darius Basley is planning to sign a non-guaranteed 3-year deal with the Utah Jazz, sources tell ESPN. He averaged 21 points, 9.9 rebounds, and 3.5 assists for Delaware of the G League this season. A little strange how that was worded there, but he was a standout on the Blue Coats throughout the season. And Basley did get that 10-day contract for a chance to play for the Sixers. Unfortunately, he did not get a true opportunity. Played a couple garbage time minutes, but nothing beyond that. I would have liked to get a look at him. He is a guy who has some credibility, who has started over 100 games for the Oklahoma City Thunder back when they were in their rebuilding period and not nearly the contenders they are now. He's a guy who I like his skill set, like his talent, and I do think Utah will ultimately be a better situation for him. But that was not the only player that they did poach from the Sixers, as just minutes later, we get another update from ESPN's Adrian Wojnarowski, which says free agent forward Kenneth Lofton Jr. is signing a 3-year non-guaranteed contract with the Utah Jazz, sources tell ESPN. Lofton has played with the Sixers and Grizzlies this season. So Lofton was cut by the Grizzlies. The Sixers snatched him up and then had him on a 2-way contract for most of the season. They ultimately did release him from that 2-way contract just last week. They gave Jeff Doughton the opportunity to expand into that 2-way role, and to his credit, Jeff Doughton has looked very impressive so far. Not a guy doing anything super special, but just playing within his role, making smart decisions, not turning the ball over, connecting as a passer when he needs to, taking the right three-point looks when they're there. He's just played within himself, played within the offense, and given this team some good minutes. And that's a little more than they were getting from Kenny Lofton Jr. That Lofton's a guy that is still more of a long-term view, and once again, I do think Utah is a better location for both these guys because there is not the pressure of competing for the playoffs, having this win now roster, and all the other factors that go along with having players like Joel Embiid, like Tyrese Maxey, and the overall pressure that is Philadelphia. But there are a lot of layers to this. There's a lot of angles to this specific story. Number one, we know the backstory between Danny Ainge and the Sixers, a guy that has pulled the strings of the Celtics organization for several years, has got the better of them on multiple instances, whether it be trading the number 1 overall pick to the Sixers, which the Sixers move up, give an additional first-round pick, only to take Markelle Fultz while they sit still and draft Jason Tatum. Even situations like them trading in front of the Sixers, knowing that the Sixers wanted Matisse Thybulle to force them to give them additional draft picks so they can get Matisse, or even things like the Al Horford situation, in which Al Horford walked to Philadelphia, was a complete failure there, and ultimately found his way back to Boston and is playing some of the better basketball of his career. There's a lot that Ainge got the better of the Sixers are throughout his track record. In Utah, there are some similar stories. I also think there's a little bit of payback here, as if you flash back to this summer, there was an interesting subplot between these two teams, as Paul Reed was a restricted free agent last offseason. Now, Paul Reed obviously still playing for the Sixers and playing quite well, but there was a point in time where that did not appear to be a certainty. And the team that did sign Paul Reed to an offer sheet was the Utah Jazz, that Paul Reed did ink an extension. And to give the full layout of this, the Sixers waited until the final minutes before the deadline, just right up until the buzzer, to ultimately decide to match it. And it turns out there's even more backstory than just this. So I want to give this its full credit here and pull up the ESPN article here. And what it says is, quote, "The Philadelphia 76ers have matched restricted free agent Paul Reed's 3-year, $23 million offer sheet with the Utah Jazz and will retain him," sources tell ESPN on Sunday night. Reed signed the offer sheet on Saturday morning, and the Sixers waited until 90 minutes prior to the 11:59 Eastern Time Sunday deadline to inform Utah that they had matched the sheet. Reed has veto power on any trade and can't be moved to Utah for a full year. One of the terms of the offer sheet provided is a unique twist on Reed's contract. The first season of the contract is fully guaranteed, that being this year. But the next 2 seasons, worth $15.7 million, become guaranteed if the Sixers advance to the Eastern Conference semifinals, sources said. Given where the two franchises stand, it was more likely that the Sixers would have the guarantee those 24-25 and 25-26 seasons than the Jazz. As the Houston Rockets general manager 11 years ago, Daryl Morey signed Chicago Bulls restricted free agent Omer Asik to a 3-year, $24.3 million offer sheet. This deal included a, quote, poison pill provision that backloaded $15 million in the third year of the contract, an idea that Morey, now the 76ers president of basketball operations, worked on with Asik's agent, Justin Zanik. Now Zanik is the Jazz GM who delivered the unique guarantee provision in Reed's offer sheet. So a ton of backstory there, but the most notable parts that I'll point out, and this is something that I have not personally seen in the restricted free agent offer sheet, I do think this is going to be a trend and something that franchises then attach and make part of the game plan moving forward, but was these unique stipulations that by having that clause in there that this team has to make it to the semifinals, so to the second round of the playoffs before the contract comes guaranteed, is a little interesting twist, because when you look at this from each franchise perspective for the Sixers, that's essentially the expectation, that the second round has been the place where the Sixers have gotten quite comfortable, far too comfortable for our liking over the past years. But for the Jazz, they're very early in their rebuilding just situation, that they're years away from actually getting that point in the playoffs, despite stretches of good basketball, which they do play. Frankly, they play higher quality basketball than you would expect from their record. They're still a team worth watching and not a team that has packed it in for the season by any means. I think in the long term, they're going to be just fine. But for this specific season, there's basically zero chance of them making it to the semifinals. So this was an offer sheet that they signed, fully intending on this being a one-year deal from Paul Reed, essentially to pry him from the Sixers organization. And they put extra pressure on the Sixers by having these non-guaranteed years, which would be guaranteed to the Sixers but not to the Jazz, attached to the end of it. So very interesting that there was this kind of conversation connected, and obviously the backstory with Daryl Morey. It feels like there's so many of these stories when it comes to Daryl Morey, innovation, the way things are structured, all these things. And I think some of them are going to continue to bite Morey, as was sort of the case there. Ultimately, it has all worked out. Paul Reed, his no-trade clause and all, has survived in a Sixers uniform for all of the season. I think everybody's happy, and frankly, he's played some of his best basketball of late. Shooting over 40% from three on the season now, has really gotten hot with his jump shot of late, which has opened up his game. Teams are forcing him to shoot it, and Paul Reed making him pay. So those are the next strides, the next steps that we were looking to see in his game. And from the long-term perspective, that begins to open up more of the possibilities of him sharing the floor with Joel Embiid, him being a true stretch four in a way where the Sixers have not really had. So I've been very impressed with the versions we've seen of Paul Reed today lately. I think he's played some of his best basketball over this shorthanded stretch, and I think being benched for Mo Bamba has been a little bit of a shot at him, that he has taken that personal in the way that you would hope he would respond. And there is one other story that I did want to tie in here, that John Hollinger all over this, saying that the Jazz would likely need to waive Otto Porter to add both Lofton and Basley contracts. The other roster spot would presumably be created by releasing Kingsley early from his 10-day. So that has become official in the time of me prepping for this video, that has officially been announced that Otto Porter has been released from the Jazz. My first thing that I want to note is we are past the deadline in which players being released can be eligible to play for another roster. So regardless of where Otto Porter Jr. signs, that he will not be eligible to play in the postseason. A bit of a bummer for Otto, that you would think if the franchise wants to do right by him and kind of knew this was coming, they would have at least freed him so he had the opportunity. But the situation is the situation. Now, with that being said, I still think he's a guy worth kicking the tires on from the Sixers' perspective, particularly during the shorthanded stretch. That at this point in time, the Sixers are holding on, hanging on, just hoping to stay afloat until Joel Embiid returns, until the rest of the roster gets healthy. Hopefully Tyrese Maxey being back soon. Otto Porter Jr. is still a guy that can give you at least solid minutes. And to pull up what he's looked like, his stats of late, a little more underwhelming than I expected, but overall, this season did not play a single game in a Jazz uniform. He started with the Raptors this year, averaged just 2.6 points, 1.9 rebounds, just 11.6 minutes per game, only played 15 games this season. He's really been a guy that injuries have got the better of him for most of his career. I mean, if you want to look all the way back, there's only been 1 year since 2018-19 that he's played more than 56 games, that coming in 21-22 with the Golden State Warriors, which he was very productive in his 22.2 minutes per game, adding 8.2 points, 5.7 rebounds, 1.7 assists. He also shot 37% from three, 46.4% from the field. He is a guy who I would lump into the category of more theoretical basketball players in the actuality, that I think the best version of Otto Porter in our heads is unfortunately better than the version that we see on the floor. But when we are getting these sorts of lineups that we're seeing for this Sixers team, at least Otto Porter Jr., I know, has been around the block, knows how to play in the NBA, and there are some guys that are getting legitimate minutes that I don't quite feel that way about right now. And if the Tobias Harris frustrations continue to be boiling over, I'm not saying Otto Porter Jr. is in any way better than him as a basketball player. He unfortunately isn't. The reality is the reality there. But he's still an option, that if Tobias continues to struggle, if you want to just put a little pressure in the back of his mind of you got to step it up or we have a guy coming in, I don't think it's the worst idea. As the Sixers currently stand, they still have 2 open roster spots, that they still are in the situation where they need to complete the roster before the season's conclusion. And I get the logic of wanting to make sure you're taking in guys that can still play an impact in the players, the team in the playoffs. The players that have already been made available ahead of that deadline can be added, even if they're not on a roster yet. They can be added and be eligible as long as they were freed by that date, which was, I believe, last week. I think it was March 1st. I forget the exact one off the top of my head. No, I talked about it a little bit in one of the other videos. But the bottom line is Otto Porter does not fit that, but I still think there's value in staying afloat during this period. They picked up a scrappy win, one of the worst basketball games that I've ever seen. Felt like some Big Ten college action, but they did take down the Knicks in the lowest scoring game in over 8 years. Those are the scrappy wins that they need, and I do think Otto Porter is at least a body that could help them in that direction. So we'll see what happens from here. I don't love that the Sixers are getting this young talent scooped up for no reason. I get that Basley and Lofton both had somewhat of an opportunity to carve out their role in the Sixers. I think this is a little indicative of what the Sixers' view of them was, and ultimately I think Utah is a much better situation for them to be able to grow for each of them as players. So we'll be wishing them both the best. We'll be rooting for them for here on out, but I don't love Danny Ainge picking in the pockets of the Sixers organization. Don't love that whatsoever. But let me know what you guys think. Is this a big deal whatsoever? Is this something you're concerned about? Is this something that it's just a little payback for the Paul Reed situation? And do you have any interest in Otto Porter Jr.? Want to hear it all in the comments. Also, make sure you're smashing that subscribe button, dropping a like on the video. I'll be back with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.